All right, so for our last segment for today's lecture, we'll start with thinking about, we'll get through more than one, but think about the commander-in-chief role, okay? So, of course, the Constitution in Article 2 makes President commander-in-chief of the armed forces, right? So, this is actually a very important thing that the Constitution does, okay? Because it puts the military in command, under the chain of command of somebody who has to be elected, okay? You want the military to have to respond to elections, right? Have to respond to what the people have decided in a given election. Okay, countries where it's not clear that the chief executive is also over the military, also countries where you tend to have lots of coups and things like that. So we don't really want to have that. All right. Now, the Constitution doesn't say what that really means that the president is commander-in-chief. Okay? It does say that Congress has the power to declare war. We haven't officially declared war since World War II. So does that mean we have been living in an uninterrupted era of peace since World War II? Everything's been nice, wonderful all around the world. The United States has never gotten involved in any sort of conflict. No. Okay? So if you were somebody who served in, let's say, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, any of a number of more minor, smaller conflicts, probably what you experienced was not any different from war, right? You didn't think, well, this is just a conflict, this is not a war, right? Probably felt the same, right? But Congress never officially declared war, okay? And so that power to declare war has really become basically meaningless. Okay? Presidents, as commander-in-chief, can order the military to fight wars, whether Congress declares them or not. And obviously, choosing to fight the war is more important than choosing to declare the war. Okay? And so, now they did this. There was a debate at the Constitutional Convention, actually, about this specific point. And the original language was that Congress would have the authority to make war, which would give Congress the ability to decide, are we going to war or not just to declare that we're going to war. But the concern was that it would take too long in a crisis to get Congress together and get them to act to make war, and so it made more sense to give the power to a single unitary actor who could just respond and didn't have to, gather with a quorum in a particular following particular procedure and then have a debate and then decide to do something, right? But it means that Congress doesn't have a lot of power over what the military as it currently exists does today, okay? Presidents basically issuing executive orders to the military, which is part of the executive branch, right? Order the military to take particular actions, which can include engaging in war, right? Engaging in conflict. Now, Congress does have influence at a more general level because they control the military's budget. So Congress makes the decisions that, lead us to have a certain size of military. Congress makes decisions that lead to us having particular weapon systems, particular airplanes, particular ships, or not. Right? Congress makes decisions that can go a long way towards influencing what military exists that the president can make use of. But generally, as I mentioned before, since World War II, when we've gotten to the Cold War, we've maintained a large military at all times, and so that hasn't provided that much of a limit on presidents' ability to make war if that's what they decide the United States needs to do. Okay. Now, Congress can put in rules about how the military can be used, and they can put in rules that shape those executive orders that can or cannot be issued to the military. So, if the president wants to order the military into action inside the boundaries of the United States, for example, presidents can only do that under one of three circumstances. Okay? One, if there's an invasion. That makes sense. So if a foreign country invades the United States, we would like the president to be able to order the military to respond. We don't want to be like, if you made it past the border, there's nothing I can do. Right? That's it. The second is in the case of an insurrection. Okay, so there's a rebellion against the government. The president can order the military into action to suppress a rebellion, to put down an insurrection. And the third situation is they can order the military to respond in order to help a governor who has requested assistance. So if the governor of a state has requested assistance, the president can send the military to help. So we see this most commonly in the wake of a natural disaster. Okay, when you have military sent in to help with recovery efforts, for example. Okay, and after a hurricane, after an earthquake, after a tornado, right, most commonly with hurricanes, since those tend to affect the broadest area. Now, can't automatically do it, right? So just because there's a hurricane doesn't mean you can send the military in, right? So after Katrina, for example, hit New Orleans, there was a lot of criticism of then President Bush about not sending the military into New Orleans to help. But he actually couldn't do it until the governor of Louisiana formally requested assistance, and she waited about a week to send that request in. Once he got that request, he was able to do it. Legally, he could not do it up to that point. Congress had said, can't do it except under these three circumstances. Okay, and they didn't make natural disaster one of the circumstances where you could do it. All right, final thing under Commander-in-Chief, the President does commission officers. This doesn't really come up very often. I mean, presidents sign off on people becoming officers, presidents sign off on promotions. They do get involved at the top level. So when you are thinking about somebody being appointed Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary of the Navy, presidents do pick those people, or at least they make those appointments specifically. But you know, when you're saying a list of people who are being promoted to captain in the Army, yeah, the president's gonna, approve of that, but is any president actually looking through the list and saying, oh yeah, this person should get it, that person shouldn't? No, the president doesn't know who any of those people are, most likely, right? So it doesn't really come up in a meaningful way, again, except at the very top, in a way that's very similar to what happens in all other agencies anyway, right? So presidents are appointing people at the top level of other agencies in the federal government. They're also approving people to be appointed in the military at the very top. All right, questions about that? All right, and the last one we'll talk about today, we'll get to the rest of these next time, but we'll think about the president as chief diplomat, okay? So there's three things that the Constitution says for presidents that make the president chief diplomat. First of all, the president is the one who receives ambassadors from other countries. So in another country, a country's government appoints an ambassador to the United States, right? That person then presents his or her credentials to the president or somebody the president has appointed for that purpose, right? When that person wants to speak with the US government, that person speaks with the president or somebody the president has chosen to have that conversation. Right? At the same time, the president is appointing our ambassadors to other countries. So the person the United States sends to go and speak for it before another government somewhere else in the world is somebody the president has picked. Those do have to be confirmed by the Senate. Those confirmation hearings tend to be pretty easy. Not a whole lot of people appointed to ambassador positions who get rejected by the Senate. This is not seen as that powerful or important a position. You're there to represent somebody else's viewpoint. You're not there to really make policy yourself, so it doesn't tend to get very heated in those debates, although the Senate can if they want. reject somebody. And of course, the president is the one that negotiates treaties. So when the United States makes a treaty with another country, it is the president, or again, people the president whom the president has appointed, who are actively engaged in those negotiations. Any treaty, though, that the president negotiates has to be confirmed by a 2/3 vote in the Senate. So 2/3 of the Senate has to agree to that treaty before it goes into effect. So it doesn't matter if the president signs a treaty. All that does is start the process of sending that treaty to the Senate for consideration. If 2/3 of the Senate approves it, then the United States is formally agreeing to that treaty, and the United States is bound by whatever's in that treaty. If you don't get 2/3 support in the Senate, then it's a wasted piece of paper. It doesn't do anything, right? At least not with concerns to the United States. Right? Now, presidents have gotten powers, have assumed powers that relate to that chief diplomat role that are not explicitly in the Constitution, right? So as we're seeing right now in lots of ways, Congress has ceded a lot of authority over trade agreements to the president. Okay. Again, this is an issue where there's debate about where that line is and how much, but Congress has clearly said to presidents, you can do things like negotiate deals with other countries that fall short of the level of treaties in terms of tariffs, in terms of trade agreements. Presidents can set tariff levels, okay, at least to an extent. There's a debate right now about how broad that power is, but there is legislation giving the president the authority to just set tariff levels under certain circumstances, okay, which is really a congressional power, right? It's deciding on the amount of a tax, okay, but Congress has ceded that to the president to make it easier for the country to react quickly. And then there are executive agreements, which I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture, where presidents basically are trying to do something that's like a treaty with another country, but they are really only binding themselves to take particular actions. So an executive agreement can't deal with the president promising something that the president doesn't have the authority to do. Right, so if it requires congressional action, you really can't make an executive agreement on it. But if it's something that you can accomplish through executive order, you can make that agreement. And then you're hoping, as I mentioned before, that the next president is going to uphold that executive agreement because that president's going to want his or her agreements to be upheld in future administrations, right? But none of that executive agreement, none of that power to set tariffs or make other decisions on trade policy, none of that's in the Constitution. That's either come through congressional action or through presidents asserting the ability to do something and nobody really preventing them from doing it. All right, questions about any of that so far? All right, we've got a couple more roles of the president to think about and some more limits to think about. But we'll get to those next time. So we'll stop there for now, and I will see you on Wednesday.